New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, Mind, Body, Spirit University, a leader in fully accredited in-person and online U.S. college degree programs in the topics we cover here. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to look at dowsing and how it compares with remote viewing. My guest, Dr. Paul Smith, is an expert in both subjects. He is currently the president of the International Remote Viewing Association, and he is the author of several books on remote viewing, including The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing and Reading the Enemy's Mind. In addition to that, he has DVD courses on how to do both dowsing and remote viewing. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again. And I might say, for our viewers who are interested, our previous interviews on training remote viewing are the most popular ones so far in the New Thinking Aloud video collection.
I think that's exciting. And I figure I'm getting my 15 minutes of fame 30 seconds at a time. So.
Well, today we're going to look at dowsing and how it compares with remote viewing. I think one of the first things about it that strikes me is that the military has had an interest in both.
Yes. In fact, really, that's why remote viewing even has really seen the light of day in a way. It was secret, really. Mm-hmm. Remote viewing itself wasn't exactly secret. It was
sort of an open secret.
It was open secret. It was kind of tucked away in scientific journals, and in a certain portion of the parapsychology community knew about it, but it wasn't very widely publicly known about. And part of that was because the major efforts in it were being done behind a classified curtain, essentially. Yes. The military was pursuing it, research programs, and also applying it operationally. And
but of course, let me just interrupt for a second because Puthoff and Targ had published a book, Mind Reach. And there was also another book, Targ and Harari published, The Mind Race, very early in the game. In fact, I seem to recall Skip Atwater, who helped develop the military remote viewing program, was inspired by Mind Reach.
Mind Reach, yes. Interesting story about that. He came across that in conjunction with his duties as an operational security specialist in the Army. Yeah. And he said, how do we defend against this? And there was no answer to that.
And there still isn't.
There still isn't. But at least because of that motivated him to go out and find a way at least to apply it.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's the first thing the military was concerned about is how do we protect ourselves, our secrets from being viewed by remote viewers of our enemies.
And then, as is typical of any defense establishment, then they said, well, we've defended ourselves. How can we use it to attack them? And so they found ways.
Although I recall back in the Vietnam era, there were many stories about the military training Marines, I think it was, to use dowsing to locate landmines.
Louis Matasha, actually, a widely famous dowser, was actually, I want to say commissioned, but he wasn't exactly commissioned. He sort of volunteered and they accepted him to train Marines in finding booby traps and hidden tunnels and things like that. And as Louis has said, he was successful. In fact, Chris Bird's book, The Divining Hand, as I recall, has photos of some of the Marines doing their dowsing and having some success at that. And Lewis was very excited when he says that he got reports back from the field that the Marines were actually having some success with it. There's an article in Stars and Stripes about the Marine dowsers in Vietnam, and even the I believe it was Wall Street Journal had a small cover article on that, but it went away. And, people stopped talking about it, and I think they stopped using it largely.
How did you get into dowsing?
I got into dowsing when we found out remote viewing didn't work for certain things, or at least didn't work as well as it needed to. And of course, I got into remote viewing, I would say by accident. It was an accident on my part. I just happened to move into the right place at the right time with the right background, and I was recruited. I had no idea that remote viewing even existed. I'd never heard the term before until my next door neighbor, Skip Atwater, one day knocked on the door and he said, I think you might be good at what we do over in our project, which was a black project. I said, well, what's that? And he said, I can't tell you. And then I said, well, how am I going to know whether I'm going to be good or not? But that got all sorted out, right? And then eventually I signed on. But
if I recall, you were a major.
At the time, I was a captain. Yeah. In fact, I spent almost my entire captaincy as a remote viewer.
You were a major when you retired then?
Yes, and I got promoted actually out of that program. I got promoted to major, but I didn't pin on until Desert Storm. I was in Desert Storm with the 101st Airborne, and from then on, I was a major the rest of the time. But as a remote viewer, I was a captain. So, but what we found was remote viewing was actually very useful for some things. Now, the first thing I have to say, there's this disclaimer I always give folks: it doesn't always work.
Yeah.
If you listen to all the stories you hear on the media and stuff from the former remote viewers and
particularly the ones who are selling high price courses.
Yes. Well, I actually sell a high price course, but
yes, I should mention you are the founder of Remote Viewing Instructional Services, and I know you have courses, but I'm not talking. You don't charge sky high prices.
I don't know. It depends on how you define it, but frankly, I believe I charge a fair price for what people get. I mean, I limit my student-teacher ratio to 2 students per instructor, and the class is 40 hours, 5.5 days. It's the equivalent of a full semester university course. So I don't think I'm overcharging for that.
Okay.
So, but it is fairly steep for some folks. It's not going to be for every budget, but.
There are people who claim that the military-grade remote viewing is 100% accurate.
Yes, and that is just hype and balderdash, if you will. No remote viewing is 100% accurate, and it doesn't matter how good the remote viewer is. The best remote viewer is going to be wrong some of the time, which makes sense because this is a process, this is a phenomenon, this is a function, a skill, however you want to describe it, that we know if you put certain principles and practices into practice, you'll have a higher likelihood of success. But we don't know the causality. We know some of it, but we don't know all of it. What that means is we don't know sometimes which thing leads to what, and consequently, we may do something that isn't going to be optimum for success and not even know it.
Yeah. I should think the same is true of dowsing.
Absolutely. So how I got into dowsing was I was in a remote viewing, and a lot of our tasks. So the first time, whenever you tell somebody you're psychic, they want you to do one or two things, right? The first thing that they want you to do is predict the future, especially the lottery numbers, right? The second thing they want you to do is find something or someone that's missing. Right? Those are the 2 hardest things, not only for remote viewing to do, but for any psychic modality to perform. The reason we think being psychic is a good way of predicting the future is because all you hear are the success stories. The times when it doesn't work, nobody says anything about those. Well, first of all, in a way, it's kind of psychological. Who cares about the ones that fail? We want to know about the things that succeed. Those are the good stories, right? And so consequently, you hear the good ones, you don't hear the failed ones. The other problem is finding things or people. And the problem here with remote viewing is that it's a descriptive methodology. You don't get numbers. You don't get names. The reason is, and I'm going to speak very simplistically here, is because essentially remote viewing is a right brain function. Most of the processing and everything that happens is sensory-based, and the right brain seems to be mostly implicated in how that all works. Where you get numbers and names is the left brain. The problem with the left brain is that it's the lexical side of the brain. It's the more linear, logical, whatever.
Not particularly intuitive.
It's not particularly intuitive. When it gets intuitive information, it starts guessing at what it means.
Yeah.
Remote viewing, any kind of this psychic behavior is I call it a low bandwidth process because there's a small amount of data that comes through what we call the aperture, but we don't know what it really is, right? And consequently, when the left brain gets that information, it jumps to conclusions all the time. And if you try and get numbers and names, they're always almost inevitably going to be wrong. So when you're trying to find something in remote viewing, you're not going to get a coordinate. You're not going to get a street address. Yeah. What you're going to get is descriptions. You're going to get impressions of the surroundings, of the location. And so I think you're about to ask a question. Did you want to?
Well, and let's contrast that with dowsing now.
Yes. Well, okay, not yet. Okay. So if you're trying to find somebody with remote viewing, the approach is to identify some landmark or something that's in the vicinity and then describe the actual location where the person is. That works really well if there's someone who recognizes the landmark and can recognize the setting.
Remote viewers come up with shapes and colors and forms and textures and maybe even smells.
And sometimes even quite detailed drawings and descriptors that actually are very, very, if you were there, you could match it.
Emotional impressions.
And people have been recovered, thanks to remote viewing, descriptions.
Yes.
But the problem is, what do you do with a situation where you don't know where these things are? Like you're on one side of the planet and you're trying to find somebody in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, which we did a lot of that, or a smuggler's ship that's carrying narcotics in the Caribbean, which we did a lot of that. How do you do that? Particularly the Caribbean trick, because you say, oh yeah, there's water. Okay, how do you do that? Well, so remote viewing doesn't work all that well for what we call a search problem, which is this. Okay, so what does? And that was the problem I had to solve, and others of us. I'm not taking full credit for involving remote viewing, but we started adopting including dowsing approaches in
you're talking, viewing. I presume, about map dowsing.
Largely map dowsing, but we used other forms of dowsing as well, and maybe we can get into that here in a little bit.
Okay.
But okay, so now here's the relationship between dowsing and remote viewing. In remote viewing, and again, this is very simplistic again, right? But in remote viewing, you know where something is, but you don't know what it is, right? So we use this all the time. For example, there might be a facility in Uzbekistan in the Soviet Union or whatever that was obviously an R&D facility, but they didn't know what was going on inside.
In other words, the remote viewer might be even given the geographical coordinates of that location and asked to say, okay, what do you see at that particular spot?
What's going on here, right? So essentially we knew where it was, we didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
Right, and that's why I say it that way. Okay, we did tons of those kind of things, and with reasonable success. Again, not everything worked, but sometimes it worked, and it worked really well.
Yeah.
Okay, so dowsing is, I like to say, it's the inverse of remote viewing. So in remote viewing, you know where it is, but you don't know what it is. In dowsing, you know what it is, but you don't know where it is. Right, and so they kind of complement each other in that regard. So in dowsing, we'll use the simple thing, water, right? People like to douse for water. So you know what you're looking for, and it's water. And you don't know where exactly it is, how you access it on the ground. So you go out with your forked stick or whatever you have, and you walk around until the stick points to the water or whatever your dowsing mode is, right? And so you've now found where it is too.
Now, traditionally, water dowsers, as I understand it, do not think that they are performing a psychic task.
No, they actually think in terms of magnetism, right? Oftentimes. There's some kind of magnetic attraction the water has, and they experience that magnetic attraction. My belief is it is psychic, and I guess it's a good place to get into this, that in fact, the way dowsing works, in my opinion, and I think there's some evidence to support this, is it works through what's known as the ideomotor effect. Now, what's interesting about the ideomotor effect is that generally speaking, it is the skeptics of dowsing who use that term to explain why dowsing is fake. I use that term to explain why dowsing works. Right? And it's interesting. So briefly, the ideomotor effect is tiny muscle movements that you have when you think about things.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're at a baseball game and you happen to be a wannabe baseball pitcher and you're watching the pitcher on the mound wind up and throw the ball, as you follow his movements, as you think about them, those same muscles on your body will tense and relax in appropriate ways, but in very micro movements, so you don't really notice it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so the skeptics say, well, the dowser has this conscious or subconscious idea of where the water is, and so as they're going along, they're thinking about that, and then their muscles, without seeming to have volition, indicate where the water is. Well, my version of that is that you get this, is often called a non-local signal, so this psychic signal, if you will. And it's in there, and it comes in through the subconscious, through the right brain, essentially. And as you're using your implementer of whatever you're looking for, the signal informs your subconscious and the central nervous system. And when you get to the right spot, the ideomotor effect actually causes the muscles to contract and move and indicate where the psychic signal is telling you the whatever it is you're looking for is.
Right.
And so in remote viewing, there's more of a conscious component. In dowsing, it's more of a subconscious kinesthetic component.
Yep.
And so we've thought about this problem, trying to locate things. We knew something about dowsing. We hadn't really explored it. And at one point, I finally decided I'm going to check this out and see if we can apply dowsing. Yeah. So we played around with it a little bit, just reading books and things. And I'll tell you how we integrated the two here in a minute. And then I thought, I'm really not learning enough from books here. What can we do? And so this is actually kind of a funny story. So the American Society of Dowsers is the biggest, I'd say the biggest or the oldest organization in the United States. And they have annual conferences and they teach dowsing, all this kind of thing. I thought, I'm going to find a chapter of the ASD. And there was one in Baltimore, Maryland. And interestingly, it met in a Quaker meeting house. So in downtown, just across from Johns Hopkins.
You were at Fort Meade.
I was at Fort Meade, yeah. And so I think they met every other month or every month. I don't remember now. But I'd make the trip up there, and I'd go in, and they knew I was in the Army, but they had no idea I was collecting intelligence about their methodologies. Right? So I'd go in, and I'd do their exercises, and I'd learn from them, and I learned some really good things. These folks were great. I really loved these guys. Some of them were kind of quirky, but in a very engaging kind of a way, And so I'm learning the dowsing skills and things like that. And then one of my coworkers said, and then I bring them back. The stuff I learned, I bring back, and I'd start practicing them in our work there. And one of my coworkers said, "That's kind of cool. I want to come along." And her name was Gabi Pettengell.
Yes.
And so we started going up there, and this becomes interesting in a minute because after a year or two of attending these, they needed a new president, and they elected me.
You became the chapter president.
I became the chapter president of the Chesapeake chapter of the American Society of Dowsers. And
it's a wonderful organization. I was the keynote speaker at their national convention one year.
Cool.
And they're lovely people.
Yes. And I think what they're doing is an important thing.
And it used to be mostly like farmers, and I think more and more it's becoming, I guess you might say, new age, or at least people who are open to yoga and energy healing and all sorts of non-traditional
dowsing things. Some of which I'm not so sure about myself, but I'm more of a concrete person when it comes to applying these things.
They're very experimental, we might say.
Yes. And of course, in a way that makes sense. How can you possibly find new applications if you're not exploring all possibilities, right? And so some of them may be legitimate, and some of them just may not work. Who knows? But so I'm not discouraging people from exploring, pushing the limits on this. But but it was interesting. And then and interestingly, is Gabi got elected as vice president. So we have these two Army psychic spies running the Chesapeake chapter of ASD.
Well, let me just come back to one point, because if you're actually dowsing for water, oil, or minerals, you're walking across the land. It's entirely possible that you might be picking up subtle electromagnetic signals and then triggering an ideomotor response.
There could be a hybrid kind of a theory here, yes. Yeah.
But when you're doing map dowsing, when you're not on location, when you're doing the dowsing over a map, and the map might be describing a location hundreds or thousands of miles away, now we're talking about some channel of information that is not electromagnetic.
And almost by definition can't be physical.
Yeah.
It's got to be something else. So, yes. And the interesting thing is it works. So how we integrated the dowsing and the remote viewing is, let's say we have a hostage in Lebanon, right? We've got to find this person. We described the location really well, but there's not enough details to actually go pick the guy up, because every village in the Bekaa looks like every other village in the Bekaa Valley, right? So what we do is we do a full-up remote viewing session. The viewer, of course, would start off blind to the target. They would presumably not know that it was a hostage or who the hostage was, as the way we normally do remote viewing.
That's a double-blind protocol is very important.
Yeah. So we start off there, and then if the viewer correctly described the situation, whether the target person or whatever, or the fact that it involved a person who had been kidnapped, however they needed to describe it to indicate that it was correct. Then what would happen is, then of course the locational question would come out. Okay, so you've described this target fairly well. We're interested in knowing what you've described, where that is. And then the viewer would switch into the dowsing mode. Now, in dowsing, intentionality plays an important role, just as it does in remote viewing. In dowsing, it's very important that the dowser have in mind what it is that is being sought. So if you're dowsing for water, you have to hold in mind that you're looking for water. If you're dowsing for gold or whatever, the same thing, right? In fact, some dowsers go to the point where they even have a little sample of whatever it is they're searching for attached to their dowsing implement.
But now, if in a double-blind situation, how can you do that?
Well, what you do is get some confirmation that you're on the target, right? Now, that may work a couple of different ways. It's possible, we have this thing called legally blind in operational remote viewing. Joe McMonigle works from a legally blind perspective oftentimes, in which, for example, he may know he's looking for a missing person, okay? But he doesn't know who it is, where it is, anything like that. So the necessary unknowns are still unknown, right? So in our case, legally blind wouldn't mean that the viewer knew he or she was looking for a missing person. The monitor might know. They might tell the monitor, okay, the target is a missing person. They won't be told where, under what circumstances, anything like that, because they don't want to contaminate the viewing process. The monitor at least knows it's a missing person. So when the viewer...
Now, when you say contaminate, you mean that should the viewer get that little bit of information, it might, it's called front loading, and it stimulates the conscious mind.
Or sensory leakage, depending on how they get it.
In other words, the logical mind is going to start making guesses. As soon as it has a scrap of information.
And interestingly, that's why being blind is so important in remote viewing. It's not because you're trying to keep the viewer from cheating. It's because knowing what the target is makes it even harder to get the data correct. So you keep them blind, and the monitor doesn't say anything about what the target is, and they don't know anything about anything other than the fact it's a missing person. This is just an example, right? But when the viewer then describes in fair detail the missing person and the setting in which that missing person is, then the monitor has some confidence that they're on the target. At that point, they say, okay, well, you've described this and this and this and this. And that's all they have to say, right, is repeat back what the viewer's described. And they'll say, okay, so we're interested in finding the location that you've described. And so the viewer usually doesn't have to be told to use dowsing. The viewer will say, okay, well, I'm going to dowse this. And what we would often do, we start off with laying out a map. We stop doing that, because a map has too much info on it, right? And it becomes a front-loaded situation. If you unfold a map of the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, instantly the viewer knows way too much about what's happening here. Now, I say way too much. It's possible they could still successfully dowse, because in dowsing you know what you're looking for, you just don't know where it is, right?
Right. And many psychic tasks, if you're not working in a scientific protocol, a psychic will have knowledge. But I tend to find that confusing. I tend to prefer not to know. And particularly if you have a map, you've got
clusters of population. You have cities indicated, you have geographic coordinates, and the viewer starts, the left brain, the analytical part of the mind starts working, and the viewer, even as hard as he or she tries, oftentimes will take clues from the map, and it will bias
So
where
you
they
give them
indicate
a
things.
grid instead of a map.
We usually give them a blank piece of paper.
Okay.
Yeah, blank piece of paper keyed to a certain location map. So upper left-hand corner, upper left-hand corner. Just give them a blank piece of paper. Here's your blank piece of paper. Dow's location of what you've discerned
And
from
they
the remote viewing.
draw an X somewhere around the paper.
Yeah, and there's various ways to do it, but
We've got about 2 minutes now.
oh my goodness, time flies.
It does,
Okay, yeah. So I won't go into the various ways we do it, but yeah, they use a process and they indicate where on the map they feel is the actual target.
And the
is.
process often somehow involves the muscles.
Well, it's very kinesthetic, right? You go, and sometimes you get some kind of a sensation or reaction where, if you're sliding a ruler across and it cuts the line where the target is, you might get I get a little tingle. And then I mark it. Other people, they may get some other indicator if they're using a pendulum. That's why you often use a device, a pendulum or L-rods, because then those indicate.
There are many different instruments that dowsers work with.
Yeah, and it's generally personal preference and whatever seems to work for you. So that's how we integrate it. And it didn't work all the time, but sometimes, like with remote viewing, it worked really well. And maybe in some other interview, I can tell you some of those stories.
I know there are many stories involving the actual location and a successful recapture of missing people.
Yes, although we had a lot of success in capturing contraband and narco traffickers using dowsing. Yeah, a lot of success at that.
And of course, any of our viewers can look at some of the literature on dowsing. There's some amazing stories in the dowsing literature, just as there is with remote viewing.
Yeah, and both my books actually, the first book has more, Reading the Enemy's Mind has more about our search problems and stuff, but there's still some in the Essential Guide to Remote Viewing as well.
Well, Paul, the time has gone quickly.
Wow, that's amazing.
We've covered a lot of ground, but this has been fascinating, and it's really intriguing to me how different methodological tools work in the context of human psychic functioning. Thank you so much for being with me.
Oh, you're welcome. This was a lot of fun.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the New Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy.